Thank you very much, Bertolt, for that introduction and for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be here. It's always a privilege to have an opportunity to present one's work. I thought I would begin today by telling you a very brief word about our Human Rights Institute, which has shaped my work for the last 10 years or so. This is the home webpage. It's just a still image of it, and I wish you can see the address. But I hope that perhaps you get a chance to visit the website and see all of our activities. The beautiful photographs come from the Robin Romano archive. He's a photographer who has devoted his career to photographing children, child laborers actually throughout the world. And we use them in the website, so I always like to point people to them. And next fall, we're going to be celebrating the 10th anniversary conference of the Institute, and I will be organizing one panel out of the research group that I head at the Institute, which is the research program on humanitarianism. And that panel will be on photography and humanitarianism, the photograph rethought. And this very briefly is the structure of the Institute. It really divides itself into two main areas of activity: the teaching mission, which has a new undergraduate major, which students have to take as part of a double major. They need another major plus the human rights major. It has a graduate program, a certificate in human rights. It's also interdisciplinary, and it's run jointly with the law school. So students from liberal arts can go over to the law school and take classes on the other way around. And then it has these three research clusters: the Economic and Social Rights Research Group, the Research Program on Humanitarianism, which is the one that I direct, and the Global Health and Human Rights Program. So you can find more information about that on our website. And if you have any questions about our program, I'd be happy to answer them. So the work I'm presenting today, the paper I'm presenting today, is really a kind of overview of the big ideas of my new book project on the war novel in Africa. The sort of literary argument for my work pertains to the placement of war fiction as a genre in the sort of canon of post-colonial African literature. It has been mostly marginalized until very recently, where it's become all the vogue. So what I argue in terms of the sort of literary history argument of the book as a whole is that the war novel as a genre needs a much more central role in the history of the novel in Africa. And that role one could sort of begin to see or identify it by contrasting the war novel to the Bildungsroman, which has become sort of much more of the canonical type of African novel that people have been reading for the last 30 years. I would like to begin, however, by giving you a little bit of a explanation of the term humanitarianism. And I'm sure that many of you are familiar with the term, but I thought perhaps since my discussion of it will depart from the standard definition, that I should just go over some of the key ideas again. So in order to prepare for this talk, I looked it up in the Oxford Encyclopedia of Human Rights, edited by David Forsyth, which has become the standard reference work on human rights key terms, and found that there was actually no entry at all under humanitarianism, which surprised me a little bit. But there were entries under humanitarian law and humanitarian intervention. Humanitarian in both of these terms is an adjective, a descriptor of an ethos and a practice. The first term, humanitarian law, is the older term. It refers to the laws of war, as for example the 1949 Geneva Convention for the protection of war victims, which I'm sure you've all heard of. Such international laws apply to armed conflict and seek to minimize suffering among civilians and others not directly involved in hostilities. They also legislate against the needless destruction of civilian infrastructure and regulate the methods and means of warfare, the ban on chemical weapons, for example, which might be very significant to us right now, as with everything that's happening in Syria, right? And the threat of the use of chemical weapons. One problem which haunts humanitarian law is that there is no clear legal definition of war. Hence, the preference for the term armed conflict, which seems more capacious in general. Humanitarian law applies even when states have not declared war against each other. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia attempted a definition of war which is defined in this way, resorting to armed force between states, between governmental authorities, between organized groups. And as you can see, the emphasis is always on defining who the actors are, rather than what the actual activity is, because that seemed to be, for their legal definition, very important. The other term, humanitarian intervention, on the other hand, is a term that came into frequent use in the 1990s and refers to military intervention into the jurisdiction of another state for the purpose of preventing gross human rights abuses. Humanitarian intervention has been enhanced by the international adoption of the doctrine of responsibility to protect, articulated in the 2001 report by the International Commission on the Intervention of State and state sovereignty, which, to gloss it in general terms, said that states which undertake abusive actions against their own populations relinquish their sovereignty. And on the other hand, the states who are aware that there's such abuse going on have a responsibility to protect the populations in that other state. So the focus of that, of the responsibility to protect doctrine is on the idea of sovereignty, right? So important as these definitions are, they leave us with a lacuna as to what humanitarianism, what that ism refers to. Often contrasted to the human rights movement, humanitarianism seeks to alleviate suffering, right, as opposed to human rights, which proclaim rights. The two are more often dance partners rather than antagonists. Humanitarianism is, moreover, heavily marked by another debate, the schism that divides those who believe in a highly focused practice that seeks to alleviate extreme suffering in emergency situations, and those more muscular humanitarians who believe that meaningful humanitarian action entails a long-term commitment to bringing about structural changes. Finally, and perhaps this was your first thought when I brought up the problem of definitions, is the issue of neutrality. The International Committee of the Red Cross was famously founded on the principle of neutrality, not taking sides in armed conflicts, right? Which in practice raised an additional problem, that of a choice between speaking out and being silent. And as many of you may be aware, Bernard Kouchner, right, broke off from the Red Cross after the Biafra war on this issue of witnessing, and founded Doctors Without Borders, and then split off again from Doctors Without Borders to form Doctors of the World, Médecins du Monde, in 1980 over the same issue. Okay. So this is where I want to go, in this towards this issue of witnessing and humanitarianism. And so I think that there is a different discussion about humanitarianism going on outside of the legal discussion and the policy discussion, and that is elaborated most recently by Didier Fassin, the anthropologist, who defines humanitarianism as a form of witness. As Fassin tells us, humanitarianism is a form of governmentality that takes care of precarious lives. Aid workers, for example, in the field may bandage physical wounds, but they also give testimony to the suffering of victims. Thus, he takes you in his book to the homepage of Doctors Without Borders, where the third section of their mission statement is what I've cut and pasted over here. Its title is Bearing Witness and Speaking Out, and it says MSF's medical teams often witness violence, atrocities, etc., and then at times MSF may speak out publicly in an effort to bring a forgotten crisis to public attention. You can read the rest yourselves. So coming back to Fassin, although impartial between warring factions, humanitarians do take the side of victims. He emphasizes that, which is kind of obvious, but it is a side. Through their testimony, Fassin tells us they are creating a history of the vanquished. Humanitarians, moreover, bear witness in the register of emotion, he tells us, in an attempt to galvanize action, translating compassion into action and responding to a population's need to speak and be heard, a form of proxy testimony. And that's the key term for my analysis, proxy testimony. I will come back to that. Thus, humanitarianism, he tells us, yields a new discourse of war, violence, he says, in the language of subjectivity. I cannot do justice here to the subtleties of Fassin's thought, which turns ultimately towards an appeal for more nuanced contextualization of the historical circumstance and conflicts. What I want to take from this discussion is the idea that the discourse of humanitarianism is fundamentally a discourse of surrogacy. You speak for others. And thus the link between humanitarianism and the fiction of war goes beyond the thematic attention to the subject matter. So war is the subject of humanitarianism par excellence, which is kind of obvious, but I kind of leave that aside, to a form of discourse. So what I'm interested in is actually genre form, right? Which is shaped here through this idea of surrogacy. Okay, so let me turn now to the war novel in Africa. War has always occupied an important place in the African novel, and in recent years has arguably become the dominant literary theme of works about Africa read outside Africa. As a subject, war presents particular challenges. It brings to the fore the violence of imperialism and its aftermath. It displays the weakness of the nation state, the pull towards social disintegration, and in its presentation of social enemy, threatens to mire us in stereotypes of Africa as conflict-ridden and dysfunctional. A close reading of the literature, however, reveals a great deal that counters these now static images. The war novel in Africa, from the 1960s through the 1990s, is in fact a people's history, an attempt to write outside the frame of the Bildungsroman, the genre which dominated the literature of an educated, assimilated class in whose hands the novel took on the confrontation of the individual and society as tradition, modernity, political corruption, religion, and patriarchy. Those of you familiar with the African novel will recognize these themes. The war novel instead attempted to capture the people's perspective and give a collective account of the peasantry in the historical transitions from colonialism to independence and the post-independence and globalizing eras. It focused on the politically marginalized, trying to imagine a perspective from below. Because it is written by intellectuals in sympathy with the people, intellectuals who speak for the people, the novel War is also a discourse of surrogacy. As a protest against the violence that it portrays, the war novel offers important analytical insights on the construction, representation, and proliferation of violence. It addresses the dangers of reinforcing stereotypes by balancing its specifically historical project, located in particular places and conflicts, with a more universalizing discourse of war and humanity. Moreover, I want to argue that the negotiation of universality and particularity in the novel of War takes place within an aesthetic of naturalism, and I get to the third of my terms there, which helps foreground a discourse of class and economic disparity, a look within and from within African societies. You will see that I claim a certain degree of generic continuity between the war novel in 19th and 20th century Europe and America and the war novel in Africa. The war novel as a genre has carried the burden of a humanitarian consciousness apparent in the rise of naturalism in 19th century Europe and complicated by its reaction to a politics of pity that had come to the fore, as Hannah Arendt tells us, with the French Revolution. Politics of pity highlights an unequal situation of power where the empowered look upon the suffering of the people with sympathy, yet see this suffering as occurring at some distance from themselves. Consequently, they cease to regard those who are suffering as individuals. Pity, Arendt claims, was the feeling that enabled sympathy for the poor as a collectivity, a relation that depends on distance. Beyond Arendt, Luc Boltanski and Didier Fassin, once more, have elaborated on this idea of distance as constitutive of a humanitarian consciousness. Naturalism, as we shall see, complicates the idea of distance, aiming both at the stance of observation and an up-close engagement with the details of suffering. We can also detect a democratic project in this literature, veering towards the rights narrative that in its full active sense aims to claim for itself humanitarianism's privileged position as the ethically appropriate reaction to war. This emergent rights narrative debunks a politics of pity and taps into the aspirational energy of a people's history. The prevalence of naturalism in the literature belongs on the side of humanitarianism, whose politics of compassion, as Fassin has argued, hangs in the balance between an uncomfortable politics of inequality and an inspirational politics of solidarity. And so this prevalence of naturalism also shows where and how this paradigm cracks and sets in motion a complex discussion of reconciliation. In what follows, I'm going to discuss the war novel in some detail as a genre of naturalist fiction, so broadly, not just in terms of Africa. And then I will identify 4 motifs which, in the African novel of war, delineated as a particular body of literature.